Now, how does he come to this very sort of shocking conclusion? And by the way, by libertarian theory of rights and ownership, all he means is the idea, really, that comes from Locke and perhaps purified by Rothbard, the idea that the owner of something is either the first user of the thing, as in the case of a previously unowned good, or the transferee of that good by means of gift or bequest or sale. That's the libertarian theory of rights and property ownership. And he's arguing this is the only one that can be argumentatively justified. Now, according to Hoppe, any type of normative proposition you might want to advance has to be advanced in the course of an argument. We don't come into this world with normative arguments already emblazoned on our brains. We have to hear them. We have to come to understand them, and then using our reason rationally come to accept them. And according to Hoppe, the only property assignment rules that can be consistently advanced in argumentation, such that you are not contradicting yourself, is the libertarian one. So, for instance, you can't argue that argument is impossible, because you're contradicting yourself, right? You're making an argument that you can't argue. Or you couldn't try to reason that reason doesn't exist. Well, you're using reason, right, in the very act of trying to do it. So you're contradicting yourself through your actions. So Hoppe, in effect, is going to say that you cannot, in a non-contradictory way, advance any competing theory of ownership titles. So let's examine this in a little bit more detail here. To argue coherently, one cannot deny the very norms that are presupposed by the participants as being true. So really what Hoppe is saying is that, Hans Hoppe, I'm a libertarian, but really so are you. You just don't realize it. That every time we engage in argument, we're temporarily all being libertarians. Because what we're engaged in is a peaceful attempt to persuade someone of a proposition. It's not an attempt to persuade them by saying, look, I'm going to argue with you for a little while, but if you don't accept what I'm saying, then I'm going to clock you over the head. Well, that's not argumentation by definition. That's a threat. Argumentation is a peaceful, conflict-avoiding way of reaching conclusions. So what are these norms that are implied in the very act of argumentation? Well, the first such norm, I've already implied a couple, that we favor peaceful rather than violent resolutions of our disputes. But the first norm that he talks about is universalizability. And all that means is that if I'm going to propose a rule that I think people in society should follow, this rule has to be universalizable. That is to say, I need to be able to state the rule in such a way that it would apply universally to all people simultaneously. So, for example, if I were to say, I can hit you, but you can't hit me, that's not a universalizable rule. Because that's actually saying some subset of people, namely me, gets to hit you, but you don't get to hit me. This is not universal, because you're not able to exercise the same power that I'm able to exercise. This is what we would call a particularist rule, that singles out an individual or a group of individuals, says, we get to do certain things to the rest of you. Well, that's not a universalizable rule, because then that doesn't apply to the rest. So it's not universal, it's particularist. And the reason he argues that, what Hans is going to say here is that argumentation takes for granted the principle that the rules we live by are universalizable. And it takes that for granted because, therefore, in principle, any argument we offer has to, in principle, be acceptable to all people. Otherwise, there'd be no way we could argue for it rationally. There'd be no way we could rationally expect everybody to accept a particularist norm. I get to hit you, but you don't get to hit me. It's very, very hard to expect people everywhere to accept that in argument. The only way you could expect somebody to accept a norm, a rule of living that's being proposed, is that it would have to be universalizable. Or if it is particularist, the reason for the particularism would have to be understood to the reason. So, for example, authorized personnel only. That's a particularist rule. But there's an objective reason behind it that all of us can recognize. Like, I don't know what would happen if I went behind there because I don't know how to deal with electronics or something and I'd blow myself up. That's a rational, objective reason we can understand there. But unless there is some rational, universally acknowledgeable reason To justify a particularist rule, you can't. They have to be universalizable. Now, so right away, the universalizability, right away it rules out certain norms. Right away it rules out socialism. I can take from you, you can't take from me. Socialism doesn't even pass the first norm of argumentation. But universalizability is necessary but not sufficient. Because it's also universalizable to say everybody should get drunk on Friday night. People are clapping for that, yeah. But likewise, it's also universalizable to say everyone should be executed for drinking on a Friday night. So universalizability is not sufficient, but it's a beginning. When we are engaged in argumentation, we are acknowledging that we value the ability to use things. First of all, I value the ability to use my own body to engage in the argumentation. I value the ability to use the things that keep me alive, that make it possible for me to be standing here making this argument. Right away, we automatically acknowledge that we value the ability to use things. What the norms of argumentation in turn do is that they presuppose a certain way of assigning rights to the use of these things. So, argumentation, in other words, is a kind of filter. The norms we take for granted when we engage in argumentation filter out certain types of norms right off the bat. So they rule out a norm like, no one may ever use any scarce resources. That's contradicted in the very act of arguing it. Because you're using the scarce resources of your vocal cords, your body, the food that keeps you alive, the standing room where you're standing. Those are all scarce resources. So you can't, in a non-contradictory way, make that argument. So a norm like that is ruled out by the very norms of argumentation itself. You could say there's a logical factor that's ruled out by argumentation. Contradictions. Trying to argue for a contradiction is ruled out by the norms of argumentation. Because argumentation takes for granted that in a peaceful way you can expect to persuade the whole world, at least in principle. There's no way you can persuade the whole world of a contradiction, because contradictions are untrue. But argumentation also rules out particularistic norms. I can hit you, you can't hit me. Again, the world could not be expected to accept this in argument. According to Hoppe, only libertarianism, the libertarian first user, I'm the first one who's mixed my labor with this unowned resource, and then I can transfer it to subsequent owners. Only this norm can be argumentatively justified in discourse, because, first, it is an objective link. It's not just, I feel like I should own this. This is a link that we can all see. We can all see you mixed your labor with this. Or we can see the receipt you have when you purchase it from the original person who mixed his labor with it. This is an objective link that is available universally for observation by the whole world, and therefore is one of the first steps in facilitating peaceful social interaction. Secondly, the rule is universalizable because it applies to any conceivable property owner. If he's the first user, then he has the claim. Or if he is the transferee of the first user, then he has the claim. We're not saying only redheads can be owners. This is a universalizable rule, so it satisfies the universalizability requirement. And finally, it's conflict avoiding because everyone can see the objective link linking the owner to the property. It is perceivable to the senses and to the reason. If you were to attempt to assign property titles on any other grounds, let's say we use verbal declaration. So anybody who says property belongs to him is the owner. Would that be conflict avoiding? Would that be in conformity with the norms taken for granted and presupposed in argumentation? Of course it wouldn't be conflict avoiding. Because anybody could just say, oh, I own that property, and then somebody else could say, no, I do. How do we resolve that? Then a third person comes along and uses verbal declaration to say he owns it. So that's not conflict avoiding. Or brute force. So again, that's automatically ruled out. Or how about saying that the third, fourth, and fifth users are really the owners? So then the first user can't even do anything. He's got to sit there and starve until the third or fourth owner shows up? Again, that would make argumentation impossible because we'd all be dead. So all these factors that we see as norms implied in argumentation or presupposed by the arguers then become filters to filter out competing norms for society, such that what we are left with is the libertarian norm of first user private property rights.